Thanks, Ed. I am Terence, and I'm here to talk to you today about open sourcing more than just the code. First of all, a little bit about me, just briefly. I'm a .NET developer, been since 2006 at various digital agencies. I started out working with Visual Basic and .NET Framework 1.1. I've moved on to C# and new frameworks since, obviously. Moved on to working with Umbraco in 2012. I think we're on version 4.7 something around then. I'm spending a bit of time out from day-to-day development at the moment to do more community work, a lot of which is focused on digital sustainability issues and trying to encourage others to do the same. And in my spare time, I run an old television website, museum stuff, helping to archive lost teletext, data from old videotapes. I also play around with a lot of old computers. So enough about me, on to a bit about what the talk itself is about. Now, to do this, I'm going to tell you a story. Now, I wouldn't consider myself a digital accessibility expert, if there is such a term, nor have I really worked around anyone else who was that I could pick things up from in the past. I know the basics, like, make sure you include alt tags on images, but beyond that, anything else I've picked up has really just been as I've gone along. Now, quite recently on a discussion forum that I help out on, someone came along with some feedback in a thread saying, it's great that you've got a dark theme and a light theme, but we need a third theme for accessibility. But there wasn't any real reasoning behind that, or explanation, or particularly just explanation as to what they thought that needed. Now, it would be very easy to dismiss that, or even worse, pay lip service and do nothing. But actually, I went back with a reply stating what were we doing with the existing themes, where we knew there were problems, where they particularly were given examples like color contrast issues that we knew didn't work, or where image alt tags we weren't going to be able to do anything about them, for example, with user submitted content. But the key point I was making across is we were working on improvements throughout the existing themes, and only once we'd done that will we then see actually, was a third theme still necessary, or had we addressed so much with the problems with the existing ones, it was no longer necessary. Now, I reference things like the WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and so on. But, as I was sitting there thinking to it, where did all this come from? And then, this is a image from The Simpsons, from a very old episode where Bart suddenly realises he starts speaking French after being there 2 months. And that's where it dawned on me, I haven't had any training, but where I get this all from, it's what's come from the Umbraco community. I've been immersed in all this, seeing tickets floating past, people making discussions, and subconsciously just absorbing that, whether I've been trying to or not. That subconscious information can then be recalled later and lead to ideas, or, as I did with this, replies to people. So that's what I'm going to try and bring out a bit today, is help people to bring out those ideas and how to use them yourselves in your own projects. So going into a bit more detail, Umbraco is well known for being an open source CMS, meaning anyone can access the code, modify it, change it, use it how they want. But what makes up Umbraco is more than just about code. It's a collection of ideas and a community of people sharing these ideas. And in recent years, a big focus of this has been on accessibility. But how can we take some of these ideas from the community and make them better for everyone beyond what is in back office? To sort of look at this, I'm going to take a three-pronged approach. First of all, I'm going to look at where you can find the information. Then I'm going to move on to some practical use examples that I've done myself, before finally taking a look at how we can take the ideas further. So first of all, the where. Both headquarters and the wider community have brought a lot of ideas around accessibility to Umbraco in recent years, but they are spread out across a lot of places. Now, if you don't think of yourself as strong in accessibility issues, getting to these can be a great starting point for your own thinking. And even if you do consider yourself well versed in it, they can still prompt reminders or rechecks. So, first place, now, interestingly, in order to look beyond the source code, we're actually starting where the source code is, which is GitHub. But I'm looking at this in a more holistic way, as GitHub contains more than just the code itself. You can see the discussions, the thought processes around changes, everything's tracked on multiple items. And you've got, you can see progress of various items going across boards. Now, where GitHub works out quite well is because this has been going for quite some time now, about 5 years I think, a lot of the bigger items have already been done. So what you see now is a lot of the nuanced work that's the sort of stuff that quite often can be easily missed on a website. The two main locations we're going to look at on GitHub, and you'll often find these cross-referenced. The first bit on GitHub is the Umbraco CMS Accessibility Issues board. can be accessed. I've got the URL there, but to be honest with you, you're best off just googling Umbraco CMS accessibility issues, and it'll usually take you straight in. That's the main board for tracking items that are either in progress or to be done, and it was put together from audits done by the Umbraco community accessibility team. Now this replaces a previous Trello board you might still see referenced sometimes in older blog references. The second location is the regular Umbraco CMS tracker. Now that can be found on GitHub/UmbracoCMS. But specifically I'm looking at things tagged with the label category/accessibility. Now this contains issues raised in progress or things that have been fixed by the wider community, and it often covers newer items that have been spotted since the original audits were done, or something that new that might have come in with a recent change, things like that. But say you're not a fan of going through accessibility boards, through boards and issue trackers. And the other problem with them is they've got to have a point in time. You know, if you're looking at a board, when do you look at that? Do you look at it once a week? Do you look at it once a month? It can be difficult. But a much nicer way to get to it is the Umbraco release notes. Now, each minor release will include a section usually for accessibility fixes, and because that is on a release, it gives you a point of time thing, so you know what you can check in often on each individual release. Each of those contains direct links through to items on GitHub, so you can find the details of the discussion or approaches. You'll often see big groups of these around a few months after October hackathons, because quite often a lot of community people do stuff in the October, and then it might take a few months for that to get approved and merged in. Which is why some good example versions for that are 13.1 and 10.4, both of which came a few months after an October hackathon. I think 13.1 was after 2023's hackathon, and 10.4 was after 2022's hackathon. And there's an example board which just shows the this is the release notes from 13.1, which shows some sections such as content variants and delivery API, and in the middle has a section for accessibility 7 issues. So I'm going to actually, what can we learn from some of these? What I'm going to do is I'm going to look into some of how you can use some of these issue specifics in details here. So first example is 15118, which is found in the release notes for 13.1. This was submitted by Mike Macy, and the description line basically says add SR only class text to table select all button. And there's an image of the actual release notes and an image of the detail screen for it. Now that first line might not be too obvious what it does, but when you read the description it tells you that it's adding some screenreader text to a checkbox in back office. But where this is useful is the SR only class is not Umbraco specific, but instead it's using a class belonging to Bootstrap's framework, and that's Bootstrap is something that many people use within web projects. So where this ticket actually is useful beyond Umbraco is it draws attention to a simple utility CSS class, which may not be known about, and you could use it yourself to mark up additional screen reader text where appropriate on any project which uses Bootstrap, whether it's Umbraco or not. A second example is 14991, which is also found in the release notes for 13.1 and was submitted by Jan Skovgaard. Apologies if I mispronounced that name. And this is about returning the focus to the trigger element when you close a menu dialog. And again, there's an overview of the accessibility notes, the notes in the release notes, and the description screen. Now, there's no direct CSS class you can use in this example, but the ticket overall is has a lot of good detail on behavioural approaches to dialogues. It's got videos and examples of good ways to build user action when closing them and returning focus. These are improvements which can be beneficial to everyone and can be followed to make sensible approaches or decisions within your own UI. Again, it doesn't have to be anything to do with Umbraco back office. A third example, this is from 13115, which is found in the release notes for 10.4 and was submitted by Anders, around fixing accessibility issues with notification bar close buttons. Now, this is an excellent example of addressing contrast issues in poorly sized click areas, and once again demonstrates good ways of looking at an easy to miss item that you might easily have not, you thought you've done or missed out quite easily, but then also goes on to how to replace it with a better solution. That's a prime example of how you can improve UI for everyone, and you can take inspiration for that because, let's be honest, most sites are going to use colours and close buttons. It's fairly common. Last example I'm going to look at here, though, is not actually even a ticket, but just something that's generally viewable on GitHub. Now, I look at this more as a thing as to show that Umbraco can, even just beyond the tickets, it can actually provide ideas for overall clever project workflow strategies. Now, the challenge is you're working on a brand new website, but you also got to maintain an old website. It's a common problem lots of people are going to run into. Now, where that becomes particularly noteworthy is if you're making accessibility improvements to the old site, but you have to ensure that those don't get missed on the new site as well, which is particularly difficult, especially if you've got two separate teams working on it, for example. Luckily, Umbraco obviously has addressed this problem. Now, you might have heard about this because it's been mentioned once or twice recently, but Umbraco have a new back office coming out at the end of May called Bellissima in Umbraco 14. It's a completely new front end, completely built from scratch, but obviously improvements are still being made in the old back office as well by the community. So the way I've addressed this is any items which get put into pull requests for version 13 are tagged with the label project/Bellissima, and that means they can then be filtered easily later and have additional items spun off or created from them. Now, it's important to note that it might not mean that all these items are in version 14 from the outset, but it does mean that there's a way they're all clearly tracked. And that clear awareness and way of tracking means that, if it's a CSS change, it could be merged in later if it's compatible. But if it's not that easy to merge in, a new ticket can be spun off so somebody else can re-implement the same fix again in version 14. It means it doesn't get lost. That's the important thing we're trying to avoid here. Ideal tagging strategy, you can use it on your own projects if you've got that project problem of all of the new projects overlapping at the same time. And there's just an image from Mike CP adding a comment to an item where he says just put in the Bellissima label since this is a UI update and probably needs a recheck. So I'm going to go on to some examples now of how I've used these on practical use on one of my own projects. So because it's all well and good, the theory behind it's good, but putting them into practice is a different thing. For this, I'm going to use a regular personal the Umbraco 13 project I work on now. It's a personal project, it's not a commercial project, but it's all I've got for an example here. Now, as I said earlier, I'm not an accessibility expert, but I had already done a lot of the basics on my project to pass scores on automated tooling. But it's very important, as anyone will tell you, automated tooling is a tiny fraction of what you should do with a website, and you should never stop there. I was at that point where I was starting to move beyond that, and that's where stuff starts to get more complex. But it's also where applying the ideas within Umbraco has really helped. So the first example I'm going to look at is what I call modals. Now, my site uses modal dialogues a lot, as I'm sure lots of websites do. And if you don't know, modals are UI areas which sit over the top of a background to allow hiding and showing extra content. Now, these are something which is very easily missed by automated tooling because in most cases it's just an area of markup. It's not, you can't really tell that very easily with automated tools. Variations in modals are very common in Umbraco. They might not always look like modals. Some of them do. You've got your tours, for example, pops over the top. But you've also got things like an infinite editor, which slides on from the right-hand side. And whilst it may not strictly be a modal, behaviorally it's quite similar. But because there's so many, it means there's a lot of items in the Umbraco boards that cover modal issues. In my case, I'd first looked over issue 63 on the accessibility board, which covers modal focus when closing and then returning the browser focus back to the original location. I checked that on my site, and in most cases it actually worked quite well due to the fact I was using a plugin for my modals. Now, a lot of people don't like jQuery now, but because I was using a jQuery plugin, it meant that a lot of that had been handled already. But because I was checking it, that drew my attention to the fact a small cross, the close in the top right, wasn't doing it correctly. And then I was able to fix that based upon the suggested best way on the Umbraco board ticket. Now, following on from finding that, I thought, I might actually dig into some of these other modal tickets to see if I've missed anything else. So I went into ticket number 7 on the accessibility board, which has discussion around ensuring text is not lost in modals when using bookmarklets to expand text spacing. Now, what this is, in browsers you can create a favorite or bookmark that has a JavaScript line of code that says increase the text spacing CSS class to increase the spaces between letters. Some people make helps people to read some stuff better. The problem with it is it's very easy if you've got a modal and you increase the text spacing for that modal text, unless that modal handles it, the text gets cut off. Now, I wasn't even aware you could do that until or that people did that until I saw this ticket. But once I was aware of it, and that's often the first challenge in these things, checked it on my site and found out I had the same problem. But very easy to fix. I just fixed the overflow behavior. That led me on to looking at number 9, which is another discussion around modals, about making sure you can't tab out of modals once one's got the focus. You shouldn't be able to tab to an element outside the modal. That's another one of those things I just assumed it already worked on my site, because I did some checks with tabs a long time ago and it definitely worked at the time. But reading this item prompted us to do a recheck, and when I did a recheck, oh, there we go, there's a simple element that was escaping, so I was able to fix that again. So there's just some examples of modals. The second example I'm going to go on is what I call the date problem. Now, I use this as that not everything has an item, but it doesn't mean you can't use the Umbraco community ideas or the system itself to give you inspiration of how to do things in other ways. The site I've talked about has a lot of historical museum style content, meaning the front end also shows a lot of dates, and traditionally I've always written those in the form dd/mm/yyyy, common way to write dates. That scans perfectly fine as text when you read it on the screen, but when put through a screen reader, in terms of how it's actually read out aloud, it's much less user friendly. Now, I tested this out with NVDA, which is a freely available screen reader if you want to use it. You can get it from nvaccess.org. I say freely available, it is donationware, so if you use it heavily, you should really pay towards it, but you don't have to. It's there for it's a decision you can make. So if I show you how this is how it was playing out in my site.
Clickable main landmark celebrating 23 years online latest edition 06/04/2024 heading level 1. Happy birthday to us 22/3/2001 to 22/3/2024 heading level 2.
Now, to try and address this, initially I did what any developer would do. I hit all the typical locations. I went to Google, went to Stack Overflow, just searching for solutions. But all I found were lots of opinions, ranging from, oh, you should do nothing, the screen reader will handle that, to, oh, you need to add specific annotations to mark these as date times. The problem was none of it was really conclusive, and often it wasn't related to the use of text within normal content blocks. It was quite often talking about input fields, for example. I could have spent a lot of time, trying out various solutions and different approaches, but actually I thought, why don't I have a look at Umbraco and see what they do? So following on from my previous advice, I looked through for any recent GitHub items which mentioned date times, but on this occasion, didn't find anything. But as this site is already built on Umbraco anyway, I thought, well, why don't I just open a back office and see how things work in there? Straight away, dates in NVDA were read out in really much friendlier terms, like 4th of April 2024. Now, it's interesting to note they were read out like that, even if the date was written April 4th, which means it was correcting from US English to British English, so obviously it had an awareness of dates. In the end, I narrowed down to, but not all of them were written with printed numbers, and in the end I narrowed it down to the fact there were 2 different ways of writing dates. Sometimes they had abbreviated month names in text, and sometimes they were entirely numerical. The only difference with the numerical ones between them and my site was that Umbraco uses hyphens rather than slashes. I was able to copy that because actually, a slash and a hyphen, they don't take up much difference in terms of screen space. So if I was just swapping out the character, it would fit very well within my existing design, and also most people reading it wouldn't spot any real difference. But in terms of screen reader difference, after I deployed that and then tested it again in NVDA, the improvements were immediately visible, or audible rather.
Main landmark celebrating 23 years online latest edition, the 6th of April 2024 heading level 1. Happy birthday to us, the 22nd of March 2001 to the 22nd of March 2024 heading level 2.
So that's just some examples of how I've used some of the ideas from the community and Umbraco within my own projects. But just to finish off, I'm going to kind of take an idea of how we can take the ideas further. Now, Umbraco has been open source for a long time, but the approach to accessibility has changed over time, particularly since version 8. Umbraco 8 was released around February 2019 with a rebuilt back office versus what was in version 7. And the entire community accessibility team was gathered together not long after that. I think it was actually by about April 2019, by a small bunch of people passionate to make improvements to accessibility within version 8. Work began with audits, which gave a big action list for people to target, and then work improving those ever since has led to where we are today with Umbraco. Now, recently they've restructured the accessibility team into the Accessibility Guild, but it continues the community work, contributing direct changes or just raising awareness a lot of the time. As we are today with UMBRAAD, it's all about raising awareness. But many other open source projects out there are at very different points on this journey. So how could we get other projects to a similar place as Umbraco? So I will point out this is a very opinionated multi-step process from me here, so take it more as a general guide, but it's how I see it as a way of going about this. Step 1, if you're using a large open source project, look into what they do, use it in regular use, see how it functions, and is accessibility handled well within the project when in this regular use, and do you see many of the same issues that have been raised on Umbraco previously appearing on this project too? If you do, that's when you go to step 2, and this is where you get more sort of from the developer point of view. Start researching the repo, looking at contributions. Do they prefer ideas first, or do they prefer solutions first? And importantly, is the project receptive to new ideas or changes? Now, I say this is important because most open source projects like contributions, but some of them are a bit they prefer contributions from people they know or from a smaller team. You really have to get to know the project and investigate the project, how they work first. Assuming you pass all that, you've got step 3, which is where you can start bringing the project learnings from Umbraco into it. I suggest you start off small, raise small tickets around an item, open discussions, and if you can, and there's a receptive to it, submit a pull request, because a lot of projects, if you come with a solution rather than a problem, they really like you. That small start can actually lead to bigger things then. You maybe do more in-depth audits of the whole system, and ultimately that could actually lead to the formation of a team within that project. But importantly, it's just about getting people interested initially and getting them to realise what a difference it can make to people. The good thing is, where uncertainty arises or where they're not sure, you can then point back to Umbraco and point back to the community, send them to the discussions in GitHub, send them to the existing tickets. Quite often, if someone doesn't want to hear, if someone doesn't believe you because you're one person, that can be difficult. But if you've got lots of people, actually, that voice is a thing. But there's a large amount of information within Umbraco's projects, bring it out. Now, what I will say is, I say that quite often people don't understand one person, but it is important I make this last point, and this is really kind of the justification. This is where I really want to end on this point. It's like many projects do just need one person to start the change. Why not be that somebody? Thank you. I hope you found something helpful here.